Stop. Don't scroll any further. What you're about to hear will grind your image of cinema's so-called golden age into dust. You saw them on screen, tall, noble, fearless. Millions of women dreamed of them, men copied the way they walked. But behind the camera, these 10 men turned the lives of everyone around them into a private hell. They shattered careers, tormented their wives, and ruled entire studios through fear. And the final story will truly upend everything you think you know. This actor was considered the ultimate American hero, yet in reality he was so dangerous that directors hired bodyguards just to survive until the end of filming. Watch to the end to learn which idol of the past was in fact a butcher in grease paint. But before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
John Wayne. For millions around the world, that name is synonymous with absolute masculinity, honesty, and the unbreakable American spirit. We are used to seeing him in the saddle, a wide-brimmed hat on his head, righteousness burning in his eyes. But behind the facade of the world's greatest cowboy hid a man so harsh and despotic that his mere presence on set triggered silent panic attacks among his colleagues. Wayne didn't just play sheriffs, he genuinely believed he wielded absolute power over the lives of anyone near him. His toughness had nothing to do with honor. It was primal, toxic aggression, the kind born in a man who did not accept the word no and treated any disagreement as a personal insult that could only be washed away with blood or public humiliation. In the back corridors of old Hollywood, they called him the Dupe, but the nickname carried not respect, but restrained terror. Wayne was a fanatical tyrant who turned both his life and his work into a never-ending ideological war. His far-right beliefs were his religion, and he demanded that every member of a film crew worship at the same altar. On the set of the iconic film The Alamo, he behaved not like an actor or a director, but like a field commander leading a punitive campaign. Colleagues recalled how John Wayne could spend hours methodically grinding a young actor into the dirt for failing to look sufficiently submissive into the camera, or, God forbid, daring to question the script. His methods of discipline were simple: screaming, profanity, and physical intimidation. Stuntmen and extras literally prayed to remain invisible when Wayne was in a foul mood, which was almost every morning after another bottle of whiskey. He reserved particular hatred for those he suspected of insufficient patriotism. During the era of the witch hunts, John Wayne became Hollywood's willing executioner. He didn't just support blacklists, he actively participated in the persecution of colleagues with whom he had shared meals the day before. He believed it was his duty to destroy the career of anyone who seemed too liberal. One makeup artist recalled how, after Wayne learned of a lighting technician's political views, he caused such an uproar that the unfortunate man was fired on the spot without severance pay. Wayne then spat after him, calling him a traitor to the nation. He wielded his authority like a club, crushing the lives of those weaker than himself. Physical violence was his second nature. On sets of westerns, Wayne often insisted that fight scenes be real. He didn't know how to fake a punch. He swung full force, throwing his massive weight into every blow. Dozens of actors left films with Wayne nursing broken ribs, shattered teeth, and concussions. He believed pain was the best teacher of acting. When one co-star dared to complain about an injury, Wayne sneered coldly. "This industry is for men, not for rags." He was a solid slab of cruelty, incapable of mercy. Directors were often afraid to challenge him because Wayne could simply shut down a production and walk away, fully aware that the studio would always take his side. He was a gold mine, and that gave him a license for every kind of depravity. His treatment of women was no less monstrous. He regarded actresses as set dressing, meant only to emphasize his greatness. If a woman showed character, or worse, dared to outshine him in a scene, Wayne unleashed psychological warfare. He could refuse to speak to a co-star for weeks, ignore her lines, or make lewd, humiliating jokes in front of the entire crew, driving women to hysterical tears in their dressing rooms. He dismantled their confidence piece by piece, turning work into a constant struggle for survival. This was a man who suffocated in an atmosphere of equality and flourished only when everyone around him trembled in fear. Today, we see John Wayne on vintage posters as the ideal man, but the real story of John Wayne is a chronicle of relentless despotism and the systematic destruction of human dignity. He ruled Hollywood with fists and political denunciations, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and battered bodies. He was a great actor and even greater monster, whose sheriff's badge was drenched in the tears of those unlucky enough to cross his path. He was feared more than any screen villain because his rage was real, reeking of alcohol and gunpowder. And if you think Wayne was the most terrifying of them all, wait, the next story will make you shudder even more.
Marlon Brando. If you still think of Marlon Brando as a great teacher and a reformer of cinema, prepare to watch that myth shatter into pieces. Yes, he popularized the method. He taught actors to live on screen. But at what cost? Behind the mask of a rebel and a mysterious genius hid the most dangerous kind of person, an intellectual sadist who took almost physical pleasure in the suffering of others. Brando was not merely difficult. He was an outright saboteur who despised the very essence of filmmaking and vented that hatred on his colleagues, turning every shoot into a psychological thriller with himself cast as the executioner. His cruelty was not expressed with fists like Wayne's, but through refined abuse of other people's time and labor. Brando considered it beneath him to learn his lines. Imagine this, during the filming of The Godfather, one of the greatest masterpieces in cinema history, this so-called genius had cue cards with his lines taped to his co-stars' chests, to furniture, even to the camera dolly. He looked his fellow actor in the eyes, but saw not a partner, only the text he was too lazy to memorize. It was cynicism at its purest. He forced great actors to serve as living props for his scraps of paper. He stole their emotions, their focus, bending the entire crew to accommodate his indolence. And if anyone dared to object, Brando could simply turn around and walk off the set, wrecking a shooting day worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that was only the beginning. The real hell started when Brando decided to play psychologist. He was a master manipulator. Colleagues recalled how he could ostentatiously ignore a director for weeks, driving the man to a nervous breakdown, or deliver venomous remarks about an actress's appearance, shattering her confidence moments before the camera rolled. He delighted in pushing his female partners into real, uncontrollable hysteria, convinced that only in a state of total emotional ruin could a woman perform truthfully. He did not support his partners. He drained them dry, leaving behind empty shells. The filthiest and darkest chapter of his biography is the filming of Last Tango in Paris. What he did to the young French actress Maria Schneider would today be called a crime. Brando, together with director Bertolucci, secretly conspired to alter the details of the film's most notorious scene without warning her. Maria's tears were real. Her humiliation on screen was not acted, but lived. Brando reveled in the chaos. After the shoot, Schneider's life spiraled downward. Drugs, depression, suicide attempts. And the genius Brando received yet another Oscar nomination and continued lecturing the world on morality and human rights. He was a hollow log with a massive ego that crushed more than one young life for the sake of his dubious performance. In his later years, his cruelty curdled into open grotesque. During the filming of The Island of Dr. Moreau, he became a true monster. Brando weighed nearly 300 pounds, refused to leave his trailer, wore a bucket of ice on his head, and demanded to be filmed only from certain angles. He tormented the entire crew, forcing people to wait for hours in oppressive heat while he searched for inspiration. He did not care that people were collapsing from exhaustion. Brando savored his power.
He deliberately turned the work of hundreds of professionals into farce simply because he was bored. Marlon Brando remains a legend in history, but if you asked those who stood on the other side of the camera, they would tell you about a man devoid of compassion, a cold manipulator who despised anyone who was not himself. He destroyed discipline, shattered the minds of his colleagues, and trampled basic decency, hiding behind the shield of great art. People feared him not for his strength, but for the darkness he brought with him onto the set. And if Brando broke minds, the next hero on our list broke bones and did not shy away from open violence. Stay until the end, because the story of Errol Flynn will make your hair stand on end.
Errol Flynn. Do you still believe that the noble Robin Hood and the fearless Captain Blood truly existed? Throw those fairy tales straight into the trash. Errol Flynn was the living embodiment of the phrase beautiful monster. Behind his dazzling smile and athletic body lurked a true barbarian, a man whose life was soaked in alcohol, violence, and bottomless cynicism. In the 1940s, the entire world adored him, but those unlucky enough to share a frame with him knew the truth. Flynn was an uncontrollable force of nature, capable of maiming or even killing someone simply for amusement. His cruelty was the result of total, unrestrained debauchery. Flynn recognized no rules of safety or discipline. By noon, he was already dead drunk, yet he would still step onto the set gripping a real, razor-sharp rapier. Hollywood still whispers legends about how Flynn ignored stunt coordinators and began fencing for real. He took sadistic pleasure in the fear in his partner's eyes. Dozens of people left his films with deep wounds, gashes, and broken limbs. When one extra screamed in pain after taking a steel strike to the arm, Flynn merely burst out laughing and suggested he have a drink like a man. He was a dangerous, raging brute for whom human life was worth less than loose change. But physical aggression was only one facet of his darkness. Flynn was a pathological predator. His sexual harassment of young actresses and extras was so brazen and violent that many women fled the set in terror on their very first day. He believed stardom granted him rights over any body he desired. Few people know that Flynn stood trial on charges of raping underage girls. All of Hollywood followed the case, and although his lawyers managed to keep him out of prison, Flynn's reputation was permanently smeared with filth. He didn't care. He continued to behave like a barbarian king for whom the word consent simply did not exist. Directors feared Flynn no less than the actors did. He could derail an entire production on a whim simply because he decided to throw an orgy in his dressing room. His jokes often crossed the line into outright crime. Stories circulated about how he once planted a firecracker inside a colleague's costume. It detonated during a take, leaving the man with serious burns. Flynn merely remarked with a smirk that the scene turned out hot. There was not a shred of empathy in him, only a hunger for self-destruction that he projected onto everyone around him. He lived fast, drank hard, and despised anyone who tried to rein him in. By the end of his career, Flynn had become a pitiful, yet still dangerous shadow of himself. His alcohol-ravaged face no longer resembled a hero, but the rage in his eyes burned just as fiercely. He continued to terrorize film crews, demanding alcohol to be brought directly into the shot and starting fights with cameramen. Working with him was a test of survival, one many failed, leaving the profession with gray hair, shattered nerves, and broken minds. Errol Flynn was a man who burned his own life to the ground, dragging the fates of dozens of others into the flames. He was feared for the wild animal's unpredictability trapped inside the body of a Hollywood icon.
Laurence Olivier. If you believed Laurence Olivier to be the embodiment of nobility and British culture, prepare yourself for an icy shock. Behind the title of Sir, the flawless diction and the regal manners hid the most calculating and cold-blooded despot in the history of world cinema. Olivier was hard in the most perverse sense of the word. He did not swing his fists like Wayne, nor did he indulge in drunken rampages like Flynn. No, his methods were subtler and far more terrifying. He was a tyrant perfectionist who saw his fellow actors not as living human beings, but as obedient clay from which he, the great creator, was entitled to mold anything he pleased, breaking bones and wills along the way. His despotism on set knew no limits. Olivier believed that acting was not a matter of inspiration, but of brutal conditioning. He could force a partner to repeat the same line 200 times in a row until the person was reduced to complete emotional exhaustion. He had no regard for fatigue, illness, or personal tragedy. In Hollywood, stories are still whispered about how Olivier could strike an actress across the face during a take, not because the script demanded it, but to ignite the right spark in her eyes. He called this a search for truth, but in reality it was nothing more than the banal sadism of a man wielding absolute power. Even more frightening was his psychological terror. Olivier possessed a rare talent. He could identify the most vulnerable points in a person's psyche and strike with surgical precision. With a single icy glance or a fleeting poisonous remark, he could obliterate a young actor's self-esteem for years. In his presence, everyone felt like dirt beneath the fingernails of a genius. He created an atmosphere of Arctic cold around himself, where only he was allowed to breathe. This was an arrogant, empathy-free monolith that saw people merely as tools. But the darkest and most dreadful secret of Sir Laurence lay in his relationship with Vivien Leigh. To the world, they were the perfect couple. In reality, it was a story of slow psychological murder. Olivier knew of his wife's mental instability, yet he used her illness as fuel for his productions. He drove her to the brink during rehearsals, demanding the impossible, and when she finally broke, he simply discarded her from his life like a used prop. He exploited her beauty and talent until nothing remained, then coldly watched from a distance as she faded away in loneliness. It was emotional abuse perfected to its highest form. Directors who worked with Olivier later admitted that his presence on set paralyzed creativity. He tolerated not a trace of improvisation from others. The entire world was required to revolve around his interpretation of the classics. Anyone who dared challenge the master was swiftly pushed out of the industry. Olivier's connections allowed him to destroy careers with a single phone call. He was feared for the soulless, mechanical efficiency with which he crushed any individuality near him. He was, and remains, the greatest executioner of talent, a man who believed that art demands sacrifices, and that those sacrifices should always be other people.
Frank Sinatra. Do you still listen to his Christmas hits and imagine Frank Sinatra as a romantic crooner, softly singing about love under the moonlight? Wake up. Behind the flawless tuxedo and charming smile stood a man Hollywood feared more than the devil himself. Sinatra wasn't merely an actor or a singer. He was an authorized representative of the underworld at the very heart of the film industry. His toughness wasn't limited to star tantrums. It was a real, tangible threat of violence. If Wayne used his fists, Sinatra could make you disappear forever with a simple nod to his friends in dark sunglasses. Behind studio doors, Sinatra behaved not like a colleague, but like the boss of a crime family. His hatred for discipline and rules was legendary. Frank genuinely believed the world should freeze the moment he entered a room. On set, he imposed his own law. One take, and I'm gone. He didn't care about technical mistakes, missed focus, or the fact that his scene partners hadn't found their footing yet. God help the director who dared to ask Mr. Blue Eyes for another take. In those moments, an uncontrollable psychopath surfaced.
Sinatra'd smash an expensive camera to pieces, flip fully set tables, or hurl a chair at an assistant's head. In his presence, the set turned into a high-security zone where any word could be your last. But true terror set in when his entourage entered the picture. Sinatra never walked alone. A shadow of hulking bodyguards with questionable pasts always followed him. If an actor or journalist allowed themselves a sharp remark about Frank, the punishment was swift and brutal. Hollywood still whispers stories of people who woke up in hospitals with shattered ribs after accidentally crossing paths with Sinatra in a bar. He was a master of intimidation. He didn't need to shout. A single icy glance was enough to make seasoned producers' knees buckle. His ties to the mafia were no secret. They were his greatest weapon. Sinatra used fear as a career tool. The legend of how he secured his role in From Here to Eternity by pressuring studio executives became the foundation for The Godfather. This wasn't myth, it was reality. He could blacklist anyone, cutting off their oxygen across the entire industry. Sinatra was a professional zero in terms of ethics, compensating for his lack of discipline with total terror. He hated talented rivals and did everything in his power to crush them before they could rise. Frank's treatment of women deserves its own chronicle of violence and control. His relationships resembled wars of conquest. He demanded absolute submission and was pathologically jealous. On set, he behaved like an owner, controlling every step his partners took. His explosive temper turned the lives of the women around him into an endless nightmare of screaming matches, shattered dishes, and threats. He was a blunt force of ego and delusion, convinced that every woman was merely a trophy for his collection. He was feared for his unpredictability. One moment a generous patron, the next a vindictive monster ready to destroy your reputation and your life. Frank Sinatra died a legend, but those who worked with him don't remember the songs. They remember the feeling of a noose tightening around their necks and the icy dread that locked down entire sound stages when the dupe of Blue Eyes was in a bad mood. He ruled Hollywood through fists, connections, and boundless ego, proving that in the so-called Golden Age, bullets and fear worked better than any talent. And if you think Sinatra was the cruelest of them all, you haven't heard about Clark Gable yet. Stay until the end, because the king of Hollywood was a true butcher who treated people like disposable trash.
Clark Gable. If you still sigh at the sight of Rhett Butler and consider Clark Gable the gold standard of masculine charm, prepare to watch that flawless image rot before your eyes. In Hollywood, he was officially crowned the King, but behind the title stood a hard, calculating, and utterly cynical man who treated his status as a license for sadism. Gable was no hero. He was a predator who regarded colleagues, women, and service staff as expendable material, existing solely to prop up his throne. His cruelty was quiet, routine, and therefore all the more chilling. He broke people simply because he could afford to. His treatment of female co-stars deserves its own page of shame in the history of the Golden Age. Gable was a pathological sexist who refused to see actresses as individuals. To him, they were beautiful furniture, required to know their place. During the filming of Gone with the Wind, he turned Vivien Leigh's life into a living nightmare. The world saw passion on screen. Vivien saw only contempt. Gable deliberately ate garlic and onions before kissing scenes to humiliate his partner, knowing full well she could not refuse him. But those were trifles. What was truly terrifying was the way he crushed women psychologically. He could ignore an actress for weeks outside the frame, addressing her like an inanimate object, driving her into profound depression and a sense of utter worthlessness. This was royal sadism, a man intoxicated by his power over other people's emotions. But the real butcher emerged when it came to those below him on the social ladder. Gable despised service personnel.
Lighting technicians, makeup artists, and set workers feared him like fire. He could demand a person be fired simply because they looked at him the wrong way or happened to cross his line of sight at an inconvenient moment. There were stories of him ordering the dismissal of a costume designer with decades of experience just because he spotted a wrinkle in his shirt. He did not care that the person had a family and children. The king tolerated no imperfections. He ruled MGM with an iron fist, and his word was law, one even the most powerful producers dared not challenge. His cynicism knew no bounds. Few people are aware of the grim story in which Gable, driving while intoxicated, struck a man. MGM spent enormous sums to bury the case, bribe witnesses, and shift the blame onto someone else. Gable shed not a single tear and showed not the faintest trace of remorse. He simply went on making movies as if nothing had happened, while another man's life lay in ruins. Morally, he was a solid zero, a man for whom his own reputation mattered more than any human life. He believed the law was written for little people, and that he, Clark Gable, stood above morality and ethics. Gable was a master of inertia. He hated working and believed that his mere presence on screen was already a gift to humanity. He could shut down an entire shooting day simply because he was in a bad mood or had decided to go hunting. Thousands were left without work. Productions hemorrhaged money, but the king did not care. He was an egoist to the core, a cold, polished log with a perfect part in his hair, hollow inside except for a hunger to dominate. He was feared for that absolute, impenetrable certainty of his own impunity, a certainty that allowed him to commit any vile act and remain the idol of millions.
Richard Burton. If you are still clinging to the illusion of a great Shakespearean actor with a velvet voice and tragic charm, prepare yourself for the harshest unmasking yet. Richard Burton was not merely an actor. He was a natural disaster, a destructive battering ram that crushed everything in its path, from sound stages to human psyches. His cruelty was refined, intellectual. He didn't just hurt people physically, he dissected them with words, reducing colleagues to trembling shadows. Hollywood feared him not for his fists, but for the toxic cynicism he poured over everyone around him, washed down with liters of whiskey. Burton was a master of moral annihilation. Gifted with a formidable intellect and razor-sharp eloquence, he used his voice like a surgeon's scalpel, not to heal, but to inflict the deepest possible wounds. On set, he relished testing young actors and assistants. For an hour at a time, in front of the entire crew, he could methodically mock a person's flaws, background, or talent until the victim finally broke down in tears. Burton took almost physical pleasure in watching someone collapse under the weight of his words. This was cruelty of the highest order, disguised as British bluntness. When he was present, entire sets froze because no one knew who this intellectual executioner would choose as his next target. Alcohol was his constant companion, and it was in drunken excess that Burton became truly dangerous. When gallons of brandy mixed with his innate melancholy, he turned into an unpredictable aggressor. During the filming of the legendary Cleopatra, his drunken rampages became a nightmare for producers. He could shut down an entire shooting day simply by refusing to leave his dressing room until another bottle was delivered. But the worst began when he staggered into frame barely conscious. He despised his profession, scorned cinema, and considered himself sold into slavery by Hollywood. That hatred spilled onto everyone around him, from directors to lighting technicians. He could hurl heavy props at a cameraman's head simply because he didn't like the lighting. He was feared like a powder keg, capable of exploding at any second. His relationship with Elizabeth Taylor was not the great love affair of the century, but a chronicle of endless mutual destruction. It was a war of survival, watched in horror by the entire world. Burton tormented Taylor with pathological jealousy and venomous remarks about her weight and talent. Their film sets turned into scenes of violent farce, screaming matches, shattered priceless china, fights in dressing rooms, and relentless insults became routine. Burton didn't simply live with a woman, he conquered her like enemy territory, burning everything alive inside her. He was a toxic monster, incapable of love, but obsessed with possession, turning the life of the most beautiful woman in the world into a never-ending alcohol-soaked nightmare. Directors who worked with Burton described the experience as walking through a minefield. One moment he could be a genius, the next a complete wreck. His cynicism poisoned the atmosphere. He openly declared that he acted in this garbage solely to earn money for diamonds for Liz. That attitude crushed creativity and demoralized entire crews. Burton was a man who hated himself and forced everyone around him to feel the same pain. He was feared for the darkness that lived in his eyes, for the icy chill that radiated from him even on the hottest days. He was a king of ruins, leaving behind nothing but empty bottles and shattered souls.
Humphrey Bogart. If you still picture Humphrey Bogart as the noble detective of noir films or a hero with a wounded soul, this is your last chance to wake up. Behind the on-screen image of the tough guy hid a man whose character resembled barbed wire. Bogart was hard not in the sense of fists, but in the sense of total, all-consuming misanthropy. He made cynicism his religion and wielded it like a club, striking anyone who approached him with goodwill. In Hollywood, he was feared for his venomous tongue and his unbearable habit of provoking people into conflicts just to watch them humiliate themselves. Bogart was a master of psychological sadism. His favorite pastime was testing people's mettle. On set, he behaved like an old, bitter dog that bites anyone attempting to pet him. He loved driving colleagues to white-hot fury with endless jabs, scathing remarks, and cruel jokes. If he noticed a young actor nervous before a scene, Bogart didn't help, no. He methodically mocked their inexperience in front of the entire crew until their hands shook. He called it friendly teasing, but in reality it was cold, calculated cruelty from a man who hated sincerity and human vulnerability. Alcohol acted as a detonator in Bogart's life. In Hollywood bars, people feared him like fire. After a couple of whiskeys, the little demon inside him woke, craving a fight. He provoked huge stuntmen and random passers-by with the vilest insults, and when a brawl erupted, he often hid behind friends or bodyguards. He was a cynical zero who reveled in the chaos he created. His presence anywhere meant the evening would end in scandal, broken mirrors, and a police call. Directors dreaded the morning after his outings, knowing Bogart might arrive on set with bruises or handcuffs. His attitude toward work was steeped in deep contempt. Bogart openly declared that movies were trash and actors merely highly paid monkeys. This disdain made him an unbearable partner. He could ruin a take by cracking a joke at the most dramatic moment, or refuse to learn his lines, believing his face said it all. He was a poisonous log, poisoning the atmosphere with his negativity. He respected neither the costume department nor the lighting crew. Bogart believed the world owed him tolerance simply because he was Humphrey Bogart. Colleagues recalled that working with him was like walking on broken glass. One wrong word, and you became the target of his venom for the rest of the day. Humphrey Bogart lived his life as a professional provocateur, leaving a trail of resentment and spoiled moods in his wake. There was none of the warmth we see in his heroes, only desert-dry pride and an endless desire to wound others. He was feared for his unpredictable malice and for never playing by the rules of common decency. He was an idol, yes, but a prickly, cruel idol who forgave no weakness, neither in himself nor in anyone else. And if Bogart tormented you with words, the next figure on our list was a true pocket tyrant, whose Napoleon complex nearly drove Hollywood to madness.
Mickey Rooney. Do you still smile fondly at that energetic little guy singing and dancing in old comedies? Take off the rose-colored glasses, now. Mickey Rooney was living proof that the most toxic bile is often stored in the smallest vessels. Standing barely over 5 feet tall, he possessed an ego the size of a skyscraper and the rage of a rabid dog locked in a cage. Hollywood didn't fear him for physical strength, but for his pathological unpredictability and his talent for turning anyone's life into a 24-hour nightmare. Rooney was an energy terrorist, demanding worship around the clock and destroying anyone who dared fail to acknowledge his greatness. His brutality on set was fueled by a monstrous Napoleon complex. Rooney simply could not tolerate a camera pointed at anyone but himself. He behaved like a petulant god, throwing tantrums over the slightest provocation. Lighting technicians and cameramen literally went gray working with him. Mickey could suddenly start screaming at an assistant for not bringing him a glass of water fast enough, or hurl a heavy boot at a makeup artist's head. He despised anyone taller than himself, in stature and in talent. Stories circulated about how, during shoots, he deliberately set up petty humiliations for taller co-stars just to make them look foolish. It was a vicious, motorized battering ram that never rested and never allowed others a moment of peace. But the real hell began behind closed doors. Rooney's private life reads like a record of non-stop abuse. He was married 8 times, and nearly every one of his wives later described those years as captivity under a madman. Mickey was pathologically jealous and prone to explosions of uncontrollable rage. In the middle of the night, he could launch interrogations, smash furniture, and raise his hand against women who were physically taller but emotionally trapped. One of his wives later admitted she lived in constant fear, waiting for the moment when little Mickey would turn back into a monster. He used emotional blackmail and financial control to keep women bound to him, taking pleasure in their helplessness. His greed and cynicism were legendary. Rooney believed the world owed him for his early success. He could abandon his children, neglect his aging parents, yet casually burn thousands of dollars on gambling and dubious resvolition. In acting circles, he was known as the Little Bastard, but only whispered, because Rooney's connections in unions and studios allowed him to ruin colleagues' lives for decades. He was a master of intrigue and denunciation, always ready to trip a rival at the perfect moment. Working with him was an exhausting fight for survival, where the only reward was shattered nerves and failing health. Mickey Rooney lived to a very old age, preserving his quarrelsome nature until his final breath. He was a man who never outgrew his childhood grievances, turning them into weapons of mass destruction. He was feared for his relentless energy, always aimed at ruin, and for the sheer concentration of hatred packed into his tiny body. But if Rooney was a rabid dog, then the final figure on our list is something else entirely, a steel machine that operated without shouting, without hysteria, and with absolute, icy ruthlessness.
Kirk Douglas. Before you stands a legend who lived more than 100 years. Spartacus, the Vikings, the indestructible hero with the famous cleft chin. You thought he was a symbol of justice? You were wrong. Kirk Douglas was hard to the core, but his cruelty was neither drunken nor accidental. It was a cold, calculating machine built for success, one that recognized no human feeling.
If the other actors on this list were natural disasters, Kirk was a methodical steamroller, flattening anyone in his path, director, co-star, even his own son, if they stood in the way of his triumph. Hollywood feared him for his steel will, behind which lurked a near-total absence of soul. His despotism on set was absolute. Douglas didn't simply play a role, he seized control of entire films. He was notorious for firing directors in the middle of production if they failed to show sufficient deference to his authority. That is exactly what happened on Spartacus. He threw out the seasoned Anthony Mann and brought in a young Stanley Kubrick, convinced the newcomer would be his puppet. But when Kubrick showed backbone, Douglas turned the life of a future genius into hell, constantly reminding him who was in charge and who was paying the bills. Kirk was an aggressive juggernaut, controlling every millimeter of the frame. He demanded that the camera always serve him, and woe to any actor who dared outperform the great Kirk in a shared scene. Douglas would order his colleagues' strongest moments cut in editing just to ensure no one ever outshone his glow. But those bound to him by blood suffered most of all. Kirk Douglas's cruelty did not stop at the studio gates. It flourished inside his own home. He was a dictator of a father, for whom children were merely tools to extend his ego. His sons, including the famous Michael Douglas, spent decades struggling to recover from his psychological domination. Kirk didn't know how to praise, only how to demand and criticize. He created a family atmosphere of constant competition for his approval, pitting his sons against one another. His pathological jealousy of others' success extended even to his own flesh and blood. When Michael became a star, Kirk felt not pride but rage that the student had surpassed the teacher. He was a cold, steel man who saw love as weakness and family as a battlefield for his rule. In acting circles, he was called the most hated man in Hollywood. His egocentrism knew no limits. Douglas loved to present himself as a hero and a fighter for justice, but behind the scenes he was a master of intrigue and backroom warfare. He could smile warmly to your face, then 5 minutes later pressure studio executives to destroy your career simply because you delivered a line the wrong way. He was feared for his invulnerability. Kirk was so powerful and wealthy that any attempt to resist his tyranny ended in total ruin for the brave soul who tried. He never forgave insults and remembered every careless joke at his expense for decades, patiently waiting for the moment to strike back. Kirk Douglas lived to the age of 103, outlasting nearly all his enemies and victims. To the very end, he retained that predatory gaze and iron grip. He departed, leaving behind hundreds of great films and thousands of broken wills. He was an iron idol, proving that immortality in Hollywood demands not only talent, but a heart of stone. He was feared until his final breath, because even in extreme old age, he radiated the energy of a man ready to crush anyone who dared stand in his path to eternity.
10 names, 10 legends, and trailing behind each of them is not a halo of glory, but a thick, sticky stench of fear, stale alcohol, and shattered human will. We are used to seeing them on pedestals, but look closer. Those pedestals are built on the bones of people who couldn't fight back. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what would the history of cinema look like if film sets had been ruled not by these rabid dogs and steel tyrants, but by people with actual hearts? How many gifted actresses walked away from the profession, unable to survive Clark Gable's icy contempt or Errol Flynn's predatory aggression?
How many brilliant cinematographers and directors ended their lives in institutions after enduring the creative methods of Laurence Olivier or the psychological torture of Marlon Brando. Hollywood in that era was not a dream factory, it was a gladiator arena, where survival favored not the most talented, but the most brutal, the most cynical, and the most ruthless. We look at Kirk Douglas or Humphrey Bogart and see courage, but behind the camera, that courage often curdled into plain sadism. They wielded their power like a sharpened blade, striking the most vulnerable places in the people closest to them. These were men who did not know the word mercy, because the industry itself rewarded their monstrosity. Studio bosses looked the other way, at beatings, rapes, drunken rampages, even deaths, as long as these golden boys kept the money flowing. They were gods in a world where morality was considered weakness. And the most disturbing part of this story is our own silent consent. For decades, we bought tickets to their films, hung their posters on our walls, and dreamed of being like people who, in real life, wouldn't have shaken our hands unless it benefited them. Today, these idols are fading one by one into oblivion, leaving behind only hollow shells of their screen personas. Their greatness dissolves as their dirty secrets come to light, when their children publish memoirs about years of domestic tyranny, when aging co-stars finally find the courage to speak about humiliation and abuse. Hollywood's golden age is burning out, exposing the rotten framework that once held it upright. It was an era of great cinema and even greater villains, men who believed talent gave them the right to be monsters. They died in luxury, surrounded by servants, but nearly all of them ended their lives in absolute spiritual isolation, because love cannot be bought with paychecks or Oscars. The truth we've uncovered today may be bitter, it may taint your favorite films, but this is the price of shedding illusions. These 10 men were mirrors of their time, cruel, selfish, and merciless. They were tyrants who ruled the dream world with iron hands, and today we can finally say goodbye to them without the old reverence. Their time is over. All that remains are reels of film trapping them forever in the images of people they never truly were. Write in the comments right now, has your view of these actors changed after what you've learned? Does genius have the right to cruelty, or does talent never justify human rot? Which of them can you still not stop loving despite everything? Your opinion is what truly matters in this sea of lies and painted backdrops. Don't forget to like the video if this truth made your blood boil, and subscribe to the channel. We've only just begun to lance this wound. Ahead lie stories of those who stood behind these actors, sadistic producers and mob bosses who turned Hollywood into the most dangerous playground in the world. Until we meet again on the dark side of history.